Hey guys, today we're going to talk about persuasion. And persuasion is essentially, getting someone to believe or do what you want them to do. Or let's say other people getting you to believe or do what they want you to do. Now, we're going to talk about three different things. So, first of all, we're going to talk about the triangle of rhetoric, which is the three different ways that persuasion can happen. The most powerful by emotion, this is called pathos. Um, then there's persuading you by getting you to trust the other person, that's ethos. And finally, the one we really care about in this class, which is logos, which is persuasion through reasoning. So we're going to talk about those. Then we're going to talk about rhetorical devices. And rhetorical devices are essentially they're like tricks to persuade you that are not really rational. So they're not really using logos. And we fall for them all the time. You're going to recognize most of them as things that you see almost every day. Okay? And finally, we're going to talk about psychological fallacies. And psychological fallacies they're essentially, again, ways where it might seem like you have a reason to believe something, but what's really happening is that you're being persuaded typically by emotion. Okay? And a lot of times we don't see them, and they're super, super important. I want you to think of both the rhetorical devices and the psychological fallacies as really part of your bullshit detector toolkit, right? They're ways for you, the more you're aware of them, the better you are able to not allow other people to manipulate you. Okay? You need to be able to understand how are people trying to persuade you so you can really see what real reasons do you have for believing or doing something. Okay, so that's what we're covering today. Don't forget, when you're done with this video, go to Google Classroom and go ahead and take the quiz. So now we're going to talk about essentially the modes of persuasion. This goes back to Aristotle. It's called Aristotle's Triangle of Rhetoric, and essentially breaks down persuasion into three parts. The first is pathos, and pathos is anytime you're trying to use emotion to persuade somebody. So this has the emotional effect of the speaker's words, and the way someone speaks is definitely one thing clearly that affects how you feel. But think of music, think of the way everything looks, think of the context and what is actually happening and how all of that could affect your emotions. The second one is ethos, and ethos is about credibility. If you want someone to believe you, it definitely helps if they trust you. In fact, that might even be enough. If they trust you, they'll trust what you say. So ethos is essentially about trust. Logos is the last one. Logos is, for us, the most important. Essentially, you want to believe things because you have good reasons to believe things, and logos focuses on giving you actual reasons for believing things. So we're going to look at this in the context of advertising. Why advertising? Because you are literally trying to persuade someone to go out and buy that product, or go out and vote for that candidate, or just go out and believe something. So here's how you should think about, let's say, ethos in ads, right? So remember, ethos is all about trust me, so believe what I say. So how do you get people to trust you? Well, the most common way is to use celebrities. So if you look at that ad, the Lancome ad, it's essentially 75% Julia Roberts, and it's essentially Julia Roberts, Lancome, right? You trust her, trust us, we're great. She's great, we're great, great. So anytime you have that, or if you want to convey a sense of professionalism, right? You have people in a uniform, you have people looking professional, you have people looking like they work at a team, like they really can handle what's happening, right? All that gives you a sense of confidence, you can trust them. Okay, second one is pathos. So pathos, essentially, now you're focusing on emotion, right? You're focusing on fear, and there's lots of ads that essentially will try to get you to buy something because, you'll be scared if you don't get it. Desire, think of any of those ads with lots of half naked people looking really sexy. That's supposed to both appeal to your sexual desire, but it also generates envy, right? So it really works both ways. Uh, Empathy. Look at that dog, right? The dog behind the chain link fence. It just looks so sad. And don't you want to help that dog, right? So sad kids, cute dogs, anything that's going to make you feel bad and then get you to do something because you feel bad. And hunger. Anytime you see, the art of taking pictures of food manages to make food look amazing, often not remotely the way it looks like in real life. And when you see that food, you feel a desire for it, right? That's very simple, just hunger. Okay, so finally, logos. So logos is very straightforward, right? It's giving you reasons for why you should buy that product, information about the product, any kind of percentage, charts, anything that's going to be informational reasons to essentially get it. Now, you don't actually have to speak those words out loud and let's say, or write it out to say, here's the information. You can also show information, right? So if, for example, they show you how the product operates, they've given you information that is going to be relevant for you making a decision about how good the product is. Okay, so this is essentially how ethos, pathos, and logos function. Now we're going to essentially look at them in an ad, and then in class we're going to look at them in a bunch of ads.
Hey, I'm Paul, and I used to ask if you could hear me now with Verizon. Not anymore. I'm with Sprint now, because guess what? It's 2016 and every network is great. In fact, Sprint's reliability is now within 1% of Verizon. And Sprint saves you 50% on most Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile rates. So I switched to Sprint, and millions more have too. Can you hear that?
Don't let a 1% difference cost you twice as much. Switch to Sprint today.
Okay, so what did you see there? Right? So notice, again, think of ethos, pathos, and logos. Right? So let's start with pathos. Right? Think of the music. Right? What kind of music was playing? Right? It's really kind of happy. It's kind of jazzy. Makes you feel good about the product. Think of the colors being used. Right? They're colors that support the brand. This kind of happy yellow. The scene was, let's say you're in a nice place, good weather like LA. People were in coffee houses outside. All that essentially made you feel pretty good about things, right? There was lots of flowers everywhere, sunshine. Um, it's also kind of bouncy. The actor himself, and now notice the actor himself looked like an everyman, right? And an everyman essentially he is making you feel pretty comfortable. And this leads us to our second one, which is going to be ethos. The actor himself is not just an everyman, and everyman again gets you to trust the everyman. Not just makes you feel comfortable, but if he's an everyman, he's like you, and he's like you. If he's like you, and he's got the idea that you should switch, that Sprint is the way to go, then why shouldn't you feel the same way? Also, he's a very particular kind of person. He's Paul. He used to do the Verizon ads where, for years, where he would say, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" And assuming his non-competing clause expired, and Sprint hired him to be their spokesman, which is pretty interesting. And again, he's somebody. He is a celebrity of a sort, right? A lot of people have seen him do these ads for Verizon, so he's very well known as associated with cell phone coverage. Notice also a couple of other things that are ethos. When the car pulled up, notice it was kind of like an Uber-ish type car, right? That didn't exist before. It's 2016, so we now have these kinds of things, and it's letting you know he's a contemporary person, right? These are contemporary times. Verizon was yesteryear, Sprint is today. Speaking of Sprint, notice the logo right in front of us, right? That logo essentially says, trust us, right? It's a brand name. If that logo instead of Sprint said, Shlomo's phones, why would you want to trust that? But the brand is known, right? The brand is famous. To let you know it's associated with a brand you already know is to get you to trust the product more. Okay, so that's ethos. Then think of the logos. Did they give you any reasons here to buy the product? And in lots of ads, they don't. Here, they really do, right? Essentially, they give you an argument. Essentially, they say, look, almost all of the phones are just about the same these days. And Verizon is still the best, but it's barely better than Sprint. I think they said 1% better. And Sprint costs half as much. Now, would you really want to pay twice as much for a 1% difference? Sprint thinks that you don't and that you shouldn't and that you should call them right now. So they are giving you reasons for why you should buy their product. So notice, right? They've hit you essentially emotionally. They've gotten you to trust them, and they've given you a reason to buy their product. Okay, so keep that in mind. We'll do more of these in class where you'll be actually supplying the information. Our next topic is rhetorical devices. And rhetorical devices, as I said before, are essentially tricks to get you to believe something when you don't have a reason to through different uses of rhetoric. Our first one is the euphemism. And euphemism essentially is you're taking a word that just seems really bad and you still want to be able to talk about it and you want people to feel better about it. So you give it a kind of a different name. So think here, this is a day at the Museum of Euphemism. So let's say start with our peculiar institution. Our peculiar institution was the way that the South in the United States often referred to slavery. Slavery sounded so bad. Our peculiar institution took the bad feeling out of it. Ethnic cleansing is a euphemism for genocide. Genocide is awful. Cleansing is good. The final solution was Hitler's term for essentially killing all the Jews. Solutions are great; they solve problems. Killing, it doesn't sound so good. The last one, enhanced interrogation. During the Iraq War, when the U.S. was accused of essentially torturing its prisoners, the American government came up with this term that essentially said, well, we're not torturing, the U.S. doesn't torture, well, we are using our enhanced interrogation techniques. And again, enhanced sounds great, it's even better. Right? Now, again, the terms don't dispute, let's say, what is happening, but they're giving it a name that allows the person using that term to take away the bad connotations that go along with the word and make you forget about them. This idea, solitary confinement is alone time, right? Solitary confinement sounds terrible. It's, I believe, illegal now in the EU as cruel and unusual punishment. To call it alone time, while technically, let's say, true that you are alone, takes away from, let's say, the horror of what it means to have that. I remember when used cars, used sounded terrible. Who wants a used up car? Suddenly became pre-owned. Right? Well, technically, these cars were pre-owned, and pre-owned sounds much better than used. And again, while you're getting the same thing, this makes you, instead of thinking of as something that's used up, as something that was just pre-owned. Okay, and our next one is Weaslers. Weasler is a type of slanter that essentially weakens a claim and gives its offer a way out. And in case someone says, look, you said this, then they can say, well, no, if you really look at what I said, I never said that. So look, let's say, at the one on the left, right? What you're seeing is lose 10 pounds in 2 weeks. So let's say there's a wedding coming up in like 6 weeks, and you say, well, that's great. I can buy this book, and then I can lose 30 pounds in the next 6 weeks. Perfect. And then you don't. Now, essentially, if you go back to the publisher and say, well, look, you said I would lose 10 pounds in 2 weeks, what they're going to say is, well, no, that's not what we said. We said lose up to 10 pounds, right? And notice the up to, right? The up to allows them to essentially get you to see, to think, to remember 10 pounds while also giving them a way out in case you challenge it. So if you look at the sign in the middle, right, a super common sign you see all the time, up to 50% off, right? What do you see? You see 50% off. But that's not really what they're saying, right? I mean, they're saying, well, at least one thing is 50% off, right? Everything else could be 10% off, 20% off, more expensive than it normally is, right? You really don't know. And again, if you challenge them, the Weasler is, well, we said up to, we never actually promised everything would be 50% off. But again, the trick is they got you to think that way. And think of how virtually every sale works that way. Okay, the last one is essentially a clickbait, right? Cure for cancer might accidentally have been found, and it could be malaria. Wow, that's amazing. You read it and you think, a cure for cancer? That's huge. Malaria? That's so weird. But that's not what they're saying, right? So if you click the article because of this and you find out that, look, no one really found a cure for cancer, there's just maybe some indications that it might possibly, maybe down the line, might be found to be malaria. And you complain, say, well, no, that's not what the title said. Again, it's a weaseler because the title just says might, right? They didn't really say that they found a cure for cancer. They said they might have found it. And is it malaria? Well, they never said that. They said it could be, or maybe not. One of my favorite recent Whistler was during the campaign, the 2016 campaign. Trump used Weasler sometimes in an interesting way. Essentially, what he would do is whenever he wanted to tweet something, but he didn't want to take responsibility for it, essentially he forwarded a tweet or reposted a tweet from somebody else. That allowed him essentially to have that tweet be communicated to everybody on his feed, but be able to say, "I never said that. I just thought it was interesting, so I just reposted it, but I never said that." And that allows him to essentially not have to take responsibility for the statement. All right, our next one is downplayer. Downplayer is super simple. Essentially, what you're doing is you're trying to make something look less important or less significant. So if you look at, let's say the Huffington Post one, Trump's Great America, right? Or the one on the left, sweet, ripe, peaches. Whenever you put something in quotes, like, you're a great actor, right? You're obviously not being literal about it. You're trying to make them seem less significant. Trump's Great America here is meant to not look so great, and the same with the sweet. If it's sweet, they're not really sweet, right? Or look at just another war, right? War is a huge deal. If you add the just another or the so-called war, right, you are now downplaying the seriousness, all right, of the war. Or let's say to say that evolution is just a theory. Well, of course it's a theory. Science is a bunch of theories, right? But if you call it, let's say, just a theory, you're making it seem as if being a theory is not as impressive as, let's say, it could be. Okay, the next one is the loaded question. And the loaded question is something that we'll get back to again later on in the course. But essentially what it is you've got this question, and it's not really a good question because it rests on unwarranted or unjustified assumptions. This is, by the way, a real ad from essentially a newspaper in the 50s from Chicago for a book. Notice it says, "Do you still beat your wife? Do you still beat your wife?" And it's the kind of question where, well, you can't really answer it, right? It's if you say yes, you beat your wife before and now you still do. If you say no, you say essentially, "I stopped." Either way, it's making the unwarranted assumption that you beat your wife. Does this dress make me look fat is a question asked with the really unwarranted assumption that it's, well, going to be answered a certain way, right? So it's not, let's say, a real question. Why do atheists hate America? Well, assumes that atheists hate America. Right? And notice it's not warranted in assuming that. No matter what answer you give, you've already messed up, right? You've already bought into the question. The way to deal with this is essentially to say, that's a loaded question. I'm not going to answer that. Or this, which is, let's say, part of a survey. What do you see as the disadvantages of eliminating welfare? And one thing it doesn't have is, well, none. I don't see any disadvantages because it's assuming that there are disadvantages to eliminating welfare. Okay? Again, just by assuming that, you are created a loaded question, and the loaded question is not really a valid question at all. Okay, This next one I use all the time, and you might have noticed that, and I would love it if you would call me on it. The proof surrogate essentially is a way of, well, you're suggesting that there's evidence for a claim, but you don't actually give that evidence, right? So whenever you say things like studies show, according to the poll, or everybody knows, right? This idea, experts say you can't concentrate on more than one task at a time, right? This is about um, multitasking, right? Well, do they? It sounds like you are presenting reasons for why multitasking doesn't work, but actually you're not. You're just saying that somewhere out there there are reasons, somewhere out there there are experts who say this. But without citing your source here, you're just making a promise that there is evidence somewhere. You're not actually delivering on the evidence. Or the the other one is the one I do a lot here, right? I read a study that said that people will believe anything. Um, well, what is this study? Sure sounds like there's a study out there, and again, it sure sounds like you're backing up your evidence since there is a study, but no study have actually been given, right? So again, notice there's a promise that there's evidence, but there's no actual evidence be delivered. Now, notice I put this thing here because in the past, a lot of students essentially have confused the proof surrogate with any time you're not presenting evidence to support your claim. But the problem here is different. It's not just, let's say, that there's no evidence, right? But it's more like that you've provided the illusion of evidence, right? As if there is evidence, but you haven't actually delivered. That's the proof surrogate. I talk about studies all the time, and I never tell you what studies those are. And when I do that, I've committed a proof surrogate. Our next one is ridicule and sarcasm, which is exactly what that sounds like. The idea here is essentially instead of really addressing a topic directly, literally, looking at the reasons you might have to believe it or not, you're just making fun of it. You're just mocking it, right? You're just using sarcasm to say, let's say, the opposite of what you want to say. So look at the, clown runs for president or Obama looking like a crybaby. Right? Instead of actually dealing with reasons of why they're doing a good or bad job, or sorry, in this case, a bad job, you're just making fun of them. Or the McDonald's, I'm loving it, sarcastically showing essentially how, let's say, bad McDonald's is for your health. Our next one is repetition. And with repetition, well, you understand what repetition is, right? Remember when we talked about the cognitive biases? And in the cognitive biases, we talked about the availability heuristic. The more you hear something, the more something's repeated, the more it seems true and real and important to you. Repetition as a tactic is really built to take advantage of that, right? So you see, why not just one Coke bottle? Why five? Why all those sales? Why isn't one enough? Look at this. The new improved Bridge Burger will tempt your taste buds. The Bridge Burger is filled with crispy lettuce, plump tomatoes, creamy cheese, ripe onions, crunchy bacon, and our special sauce. Come in today to try our Bridge Burger special, which includes the Bridge Burger, fries, and a soda for just $4. Now, notice they repeated Bridge Burger like 5 times in there. What do you want? Bridge Burger sounds pretty good. Right? So again, the more you hear it, the more it seems like a good idea. And again, the why is this a rhetorical device is you're not getting any new information, right? You're not getting any new reason for why it's actually good. It's simply the repeating that's getting you to believe it. And now we're going to move on to essentially psychological based fallacies. We're really going to start with the emotions. So our first ones are going to be essentially anger and fear. So the argument from outrage, right? Essentially, you're trying to convince someone to believe something or to do something by essentially, well, getting them angry, right? So anytime you, let's say, see a demagogue trying to get a crowd really angry about something, that's the argument from outrage, right? Again, the idea, it's one thing to be angry because reasons were given to you to be angry, and because of those reasons, you're not just angry, but you also think, let's say, a particular thing should be done. And it's another thing to get you upset and essentially to get you to believe or do something because you're upset. The next one is scare tactics, and scare tactics is really interesting. So scare tactics is essentially you're trying to scare people into doing something or believing something essentially out of fear, right? So the smoking ads are really classic scare tactic here, right? So if you look at this woman here, I chose to smoke. This is what it cost me. You're seeing she's missing fingers, right? I don't know if you know this, but you can lose fingers, toes, legs, arms from smoking, essentially because your circulation stops working properly. Um, the whole idea with ads like this, or with any of the ads for against smoking that focus on the harm that it does to people, is to scare you into not smoking. Right? Notice what makes it a scare tactic is they're not giving you reasons. So think of it: every cigarette pack actually gives you reasons why you shouldn't smoke. Right? It says warning, it causes emphysema, lung cancer, etc. That would be logos. Here you are essentially, instead of that, you are being scared into quitting. Now, it's really interesting in terms of whether that's okay or not. So, lots of governments all over the world essentially have established laws where for cigarettes to be sold in that country, they need to have, let's say, these really scary images of what cigarettes do to you. The U.S. does not, and it's interesting why. The Obama administration tried to make that happen, but the Supreme Court rejected it. What the Supreme Court said is that, okay, you can force a manufacturer to essentially uh, put down the reasons, let's say the facts of the matter of why, let's say, their product might be bad for you, but you can't force them to try to manipulate you emotionally through scare tactics by having them put this kind of picture on their own product. Our second one is essentially any kind of fallacies that have to do with your desire to be accepted by other people. The first one is peer pressure. I'm assuming everybody's familiar with peer pressure, right? You're accepting a claim or you're doing something not because, let's say, reasons are given to you, but essentially because you want to be accepted, you want to gain social approval, and this is what it would take to do that, right? So the classic here is smoking or drinking, not because you really want to or have good reason to, but because you want other people to think you're cool or, one of them, etc. Our second fallacy here is the guilt trip. And in essentially the guilt trip, again, you should be very familiar with the guilt trip. You're trying to get someone to believe or do something because of guilt rather than, because they're really giving you good reasons to do it. So think of it this way, right? Your mom calls and your mom says, "Oh God, I'm so sad that you haven't called me. You never really call me, and I just sit home waiting for you to call, thinking that you love me, and I guess you really don't love me after all." Um, what is she doing? She's giving you a guilt trip, right? And guilt trips can work. Now, imagine she did this a different way, right? Where your mom called and said, "Look, you really haven't been calling, and I'm concerned for you because, part of a really good life is having a good relationships with your parent, and you just can't do that unless you really call us and talk to us and tell us what's going on with you. So you're really missing out." Now, notice that's not a guilt trip, right? That's actual reasons for why you should call. The next one is now a series of fallacies based in positive emotions. So this is assuming that, let's say, anger, fear, wanting social approval are negative. Here we're talking about emotions that are usually considered positive, but that doesn't mean that they can't lead you to making bad decisions. So think of hope. Hope is wonderful. Hope is super important. Especially if you're in the industry, hope is extremely important. But making a decision based on hope rather than, let's say, because you really have good reasons for it, is called wishful thinking, and you really shouldn't do it. So essentially, you're accepting something because you really don't want it to be true, right? So look at this global warming, a hoax thing, right? If global warming would actually mean that you need to dramatically change your lifestyle, and you're hurting other people if you're not, and you really don't want to do that, you might really call that a hoax, right? That would be wishful thinking, that it's not man-made. Or think of it this way. If, let's say, someone says, "Oh, I just know my film is going to make it into the film festival. and win some sort of prize. I mean, I just know it. It's got to be true. I can't imagine it's not going to happen. It's going to be horrible if it doesn't. Right? Well, do they have any actual reasons for thinking the film is good enough to both get into and then also win something in the film festival? They need real reasons to think that. If they don't, they're just engaged in wishful thinking, and wishful thinking can really get you in trouble. Okay, the next one is the argument from pity. So, again, compassion. Compassion is wonderful, empathy is wonderful, but they can lead you to make mistakes, right? This picture on the right, let's say if that's shown as, let's say, a way to get you to think that global warming is happening and man made and extremely serious, and you've got to do something about it. Well, those things are true, but getting you to feel bad for this particular polar bear without any context is not going to do it, right? You're just essentially working here on pity. Or think of it this way, this happens virtually every class, or at least every class where I don't introduce this fallacy, right? Where I would have a student that essentially says, look, Shlomo, I have to tell you, I know I really did badly in this class, and I know you're gonna, I know right now you have me for an F, but I had personal problems, really like bad things happened in my life, and I really couldn't focus. And if I don't pass this class, I'm gonna lose my visa, and I'm gonna have to go home, and I won't be able to graduate. Can you please help me? And I feel bad for someone like this, right? I do feel compassion, but if I do that, right, I'm falling for the argument from pity, right? It essentially says, give me a good grade, give me a passing grade because you feel bad for me, as opposed to because I deserve it, and grades are supposed to be given based on what you deserve. Last one is apple polishing. Apple polishing focuses on pride, and we are susceptible to someone playing on our pride, right? Essentially, the idea is you're telling someone how great they are, you're flattering them, and because of that, they want to do something for you, right? It's really natural to want to reciprocate like that. So let's say someone comes to me and says, Shlomo, I love your class. It's my favorite class this semester. It's just so amazing. Can I get an extension on my paper? Which happens quite a bit. Right? What they're doing is essentially they're apple polishing. They're trying to make me feel good about myself, so I'll do something good for them. Or let's say someone says, James, I think that your films are just amazing. You're a real visionary. The way you draw the characters, your choice of camera angles, I think they're really amazing. Did I happen to mention that I was an actor? Right? They're building you up, focusing on your pride, so then they can do the ask, and the ask is essentially, at this point, something that you naturally want to respond to, because again, we want to give something to people who make us feel good. Distraction fallacies are exactly what they say they are. Essentially, they distract you from what is really important, right? From the real argument. The first one here is red herring, and the idea of a red herring is essentially instead of being on topic, you're saying something that's a little bit off topic, right? Where you're really distracting from the original point we're talking about. So let's say we're talking about the environment and what it is that we should do about the environment, and you say, well, look, we really can't talk about right now because we're in the middle of a war. Well, we may be in the middle of a war, and if you're in the US, we've been in a war for the last many, many, many years, but that doesn't mean that we can't deal with the environment at the same time. It's a red herring. It's just a distracting tangent, right? Or let's say we're talking about whether the United States should legalize marijuana. And you start bringing up the damage that, let's say, cocaine has done to Colombia. Well, that's really interesting. But we're talking about marijuana, not cocaine, right? Or let's say you're talking about, let's say, the damage that marijuana can do to teenagers. Well, that is really interesting. And notice it's partly relevant, but we're not talking about making it legal for teenagers. We are talking about making it legal for adults. Now, to, let's say, take that tangent and make it not a red herring, you would need to also talk about how legalizing for adults would really also impact teenagers, and that's what we've got to worry about. Okay, our last ones are essentially rationalizations. And rationalizations, we're going to look at this in kind of two ways. The first one is just really a straightforward rationalization where you're using a false pretext to justify some claim or action. You're really lying to yourself in this, right? So, right, you got an F on a test, and you say, "Oh yeah, I got it because my teacher hates me." Maybe, but most likely you probably just got it because you didn't really study for it. You didn't put forward the effort, right? But it makes you feel better to tell yourself this. My sister would do this a lot whenever, let's say, a guy broke up with her. She would essentially say, "Oh, it's really good that that happened because we really weren't going anywhere, and I really need to be with someone that understands me better. And now I'm really gonna open myself up to someone that is going to be much better for me." Right? So really, she was really disappointed, right, that the breakup happened. But rationalizing it to herself this way made herself feel better. Right? So we do this a lot. Uh, One last rationalization I want to talk about that's really interesting is moral rationalization. If you look at the fake Calvin Klein ad here for incense, essentially, it's interesting why most people think that there's something wrong with incest. So the moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt essentially did a study where he gave people a case of incest that involved a brother and a sister having sex once just to see what it was like using protection, and then after that talking about and deciding they're good, they never want to do it again, and asking recipients, or let's say test subjects, was there anything wrong with that? And the immediate response is, of course it was. It was incest. And it's essentially an emotional response. Only then would people try to rationalize why that was the case. And notice in the example I gave you, he tries essentially to get rid of all the regular reasons why someone might think that there's something wrong with incest. Okay? Like, let's say that you could have, if someone gives birth from a baby from incest, it could be it could have genetic defects, etc. But none of that happens in this case, right? Still, we want to immediately rationalize our feelings about it, right? That they're justified in some way. Okay, guys, so that was it for methods of persuasion. Right? Essentially, we covered ethos, pathos, logos. We talked about the different rhetorical devices, and we talked about psychological fallacies. Um, we're going to cover these more in class. Essentially, we're going to try to have a bunch of activities that you guys could use to master these ideas. But meanwhile, they're everywhere, right? So start taking a look. Anytime you see a commercial, anytime essentially you are going shopping, look for any of these methods of persuasion. Okay? Next thing you need to do is go to Google Classroom and now go ahead and take the associated quiz with this video so that you can get credit and so that you can be ready for our class. I'll see you there.